Hello, AP Euroclass. This is the Midterm Review 2021 for AP European History. And as usual, I'm just going to go through these questions and tell you what I think about them. And we're just going to go through one by one, and hopefully, this will be finished as soon as possible. Sometimes I have a philosophy that overkill is better than underkill, so I hope I'm not too long-winded with this, but I'll try to keep it somewhat short. So, what were the two pillars of the Renaissance? And they were two things: humanism and secularism. So there, that was pretty short. And then next question, what was secularism? What was scholasticism? I guess we'll talk about secularism in a second. So what was scholasticism? Scholasticism was the basic curriculum of universities before the Renaissance. It's a very logic-based system rather than observation or experimentation based. It's rooted in Aristotle, and we know that he was wrong about a lot of things because we studied the scientific revolution. And it's vocational based. The only three majors that you can really major in are law, theology, and medicine. It was conducted in Latin, and the Latin was very substandard before Petrarch went through and started to clean things up a bit. So humanism, what was humanism, and what were the essential elements of humanism? So humanism is this. Humanism is the idea that human characteristics, human individuality, that's huge. Human history, human expression, that's also huge. Human emotion, human accomplishments, human potential, human happiness even. They're all worth studying. And during the Middle Ages, people didn't see humans and their affairs as being of value. God was who was worth studying. The medieval mind would say, why study lowly, insignificant, little sinful humans when you can spend that same time and effort contemplating a holy and righteous and fearsome, but also gracious and merciful God? Humanism is also an educational curriculum, and it's a reaction to scholasticism. It's broad, it's flexible, and it's universal. The three essential elements of humanism are eloquence and precision of expression; secularism, the idea that things outside the church and outside God and faith are also worth studying; and number three, the classics. The ancient Greeks and ancient Romans created art and literature and culture that reflected humanism in their stuff, although they didn't call it that or know it. And everything that humanism touches will be touched with these three essential elements: civics, art, literature, culture, and the pursuit of knowledge will all be touched with humanism. So who was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola? What did he write, and what did he argue? He was a humanist philosopher who wrote Oration on the Dignity of Man. And in this piece, Pico expressed the essence of humanism so eloquently and so precisely. See what I did there? That Oration on the Dignity of Man has been called the Renaissance Manifesto. In this piece, Pico argued that man has a unique place among all the living creatures. Humans have the ability and the choice to be anything that they want to reach any level that he or she wants, and we can ascend to just below the level of angels, or we can descend down to the level of beasts. It's our choice. And so it's a very powerful message. So should we speculate on what development humanist ideas might have led to? Well, let's just take an example. People could express their individual accomplishments and their individual potential with discoveries and expansion and conquest. A secular interest in the physical universe may lead to the scientific revolution. The value of human happiness and social improvement, as well as the call for better education and better reading sources, may have led to not only the scientific revolution, but ultimately to the Enlightenment. So what is the difference between the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance? Italians at this time were more secular and more individualistic. They were concerned with improving the individual. Those were the Italian humanists. But the Renaissance in Northern Europe had a different kind of emphasis. Christian humanists such as Sir Thomas More and Erasmus were more religious and more social. So, what were their goals? The Christian humanists of the Northern Renaissance, and remember that Christian humanism and Northern Renaissance are both referring to essentially the same thing. They're basically interchangeable. They had in mind two primary applications of all of this Renaissance culture and Renaissance learning. Number one, improve people's spiritual lives. And number two, improve or even reform the church to help provide both spiritual and intellectual comfort to people. So, who were these two pillars of the Northern Renaissance, and what did they do? So, these two pillars of the Northern Renaissance, the two people you should think of when you think of the Northern Renaissance and when you think of Christian humanism, are Sir Thomas More and Desiderius Erasmus. Sir Thomas More wrote Utopia, which was a look at a fictional society that had achieved social harmony through a more biblical application of Christian principles. And it gave people a vivid and specific and concrete and tangible vision of what a perfect Christian society might look like. Erasmus wrote, among other things, In Praise of Folly, in which he poked fun at the cultural and religious practices that made no sense or were hypocritical. He also wrote the first translation of the New Testament into Latin from the original Greek in 1,000 years. It had already been done, but he made a much updated and much improved one. He discovered mistakes, which he corrected, and he explored all kinds of different ways to express what the original documents were saying. And in doing this, Erasmus showed that everything, right down to the very original words of the Bible itself, could be questioned. So what's another term for the Northern Renaissance? I already talked about it, Christian humanism. Remember that Christian humanism and Northern Renaissance are basically interchangeable. So let's speculate on what movement the Northern Renaissance might have led to. I think it led directly to the Protestant Reformation, in particular with regard to its emphasis on religious reform for the improvement of society, like you see with Sir Thomas More's Utopia and Erasmus's In Praise of Folly. With regard to its humanist emphasis on applying updated, scholarly methods to ancient biblical texts, like, for example, Erasmus's New Latin New Testament, with its humanistic emphasis on the individual's spiritual development and experience through religious education and direct access to the Bible, facilitated by the printing press, which, because of the affordability that it gave books, created a wider market for works in the vernacular. What was one of the first things that Martin Luther did after he launched the Protestant Reformation? He took Erasmus's new Greek and Latin New Testament and created a German translation, because the Bible becomes more accessible to the individual, which he or she can now read in his or her own language. So that's chapter 12. So chapter 13, the Protestant Reformation, and we're just looking really at lessons 13.1 and 13.5, having to narrow these things down. And so who was Martin Luther and what did he do? So what was his story? Keep in mind, Martin Luther was a priest and a doctor of theology. He was a lecturer at the University of Wittenberg, really throughout almost his entire career. And he suffered from serious doubts and insecurities about his own personal salvation. And this led him to do a thorough scholarly study of what the New Testament had to say about this very issue. And he identified, at least to his own satisfaction, numerous passages in the New Testament that seem to indicate that the only way to salvation and to heaven was by faith in Jesus and his sacrifice. Salvation was not something that you could buy or earn or work for with good deeds, or that you could luck your way into. When the Catholic Church ran basically a marketing campaign through his area to sell indulgences, Luther had a lot of issues with it that were very similar actually to the ones that Jan Hus had brought up in his home country of Bohemia 100 years previously. And Martin Luther compiled these issues into a list of 95 grievances. He called it the 95 Theses. And he took these 95 Theses and, as was custom, he nailed these to the door of the Wittenberg Church in the year 1517. Thanks in no small way to the printing press, these 95 Theses ignited a firestorm of long pent-up frustration with the way that the Catholic Church was doing things and teaching things. And Luther got into a lot of trouble. The Catholic Pope excommunicated him. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V declared Martin Luther an outlaw for refusing to recant at the Diet of Worms, which was a meeting of a large council whose purpose was to advise Charles V. However, many members of the nobility found Luther's message so appealing, like just a breath of fresh air, that they actually defied the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor and gave Luther safe haven so that he could create that German translation of the New Testament that we talked about and even form his new breakaway church. So in what ways did the Protestant Reformation get out of Luther's control? Because he lost control of that Protestant Reformation very quickly. There are numerous consequences that followed Martin Luther that he did not anticipate, could not stop. For one thing, there was a massive German peasants' revolt, which stood up against the abuses of their noble lords and used Luther's name to do it. Luther did not support the revolt, didn't pretend to, never said he would, and in fact he wrote with great passion about these rebels and wrote against them. Number two, second thing, Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin, they took Protestant doctrines a lot further than Luther had wanted to go with such beliefs. For example, no priesthood and Calvin's predestination. Number three, deadly, destructive wars of religion in the Holy Roman Empire with the Schmalkaldic League and the Swiss Civil War, which actually killed Ulrich Zwingli, the French Wars of Religion that killed 3 million people, the 30 Years' War that killed 8 million people. Number four, Martin Luther didn't anticipate the splintering, the fracturing of Protestantism into countless churches and sects and fellowships. Number five, Luther never thought that the King of England would break away from the Catholic Church over the issue of divorce and form his very own Church of England with himself as the head. Number six, Martin Luther probably never counted on an English Civil War which killed almost 200,000 people, which involved Cromwell's conquest of Ireland, which killed another 618,000 people, 40% of Ireland's population, and all of which would ultimately end with a glorious revolution and an English Bill of Rights and a constitutional monarchy. So, that being said, our message to Martin Luther would be careful what you wish for. So who are these Anabaptists? What did they stand for? And what happened to them? The Anabaptists were your kind of quintessential example of what can go wrong with anything like the Protestant Reformation. And this is the downside of an otherwise perfectly good and fine religious doctrine that says that believers should have the freedom to read and understand Scripture for themselves. You're going to have a few people who come away with unacceptably radical views like the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists were just one such radical Protestant group. They believed that, number one, that baptism was absolutely essential for salvation. And then here's the kicker: a person's baptism is not valid. In other words, it has no power to save you unless you understand what it is for and what is happening at the time you're baptized. In other words, you have to have a somewhat developed theology on baptism, or the baptism won't take. And so, therefore, anyone who is baptized as an infant is not saved. And to add urgency to the matter, they also believe that the end of the world was imminent. So you'd better get yourself straightened out and get yourself baptized fast. And so you can imagine how disturbing this might be to just about every other Christian in Europe, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, you name it, who was baptized as an infant. And so the Anabaptists started collecting in a large German city called Munster. And the leaders put out a call to Anabaptists from all over everywhere that they were going to make Munster into their new Jerusalem. So when enough of them had come to the city, the leaders got themselves put on the town council, and they took over governance of the town and made it their own sovereign commune. And this was known as the Anabaptist Munster Insurrection. And they kicked many of the Lutherans who had been living in the city out, including the local bishop. Catholics and Lutherans cooperated together to besiege the city in a year-long siege. One of the Anabaptist leaders, John of Leyden, built a cult of personality around himself, claiming to receive visions, claiming to be the successor of David. I mean, this is the new Jerusalem we're talking about. Wearing royal clothes, going around the city in elaborate processions. And he made rebaptism compulsory in the city and made polygamy compulsory in the city. And he led the example by having 16 wives. And eventually, the Catholics and Lutherans took the by now starving city of Munster back. They tortured and executed Anabaptist leaders. They hung their bones in cages that hung from the local cathedral and as an example for all to see. And this is what can be done if you attempt to do what the Anabaptists had done. But all of this brings up a more basic issue. One of the problems that people had with the sacraments, like, for example, baptism, as channels of grace and salvation, is that they're too nebulous. They're too complicated. And you can see this controversy, you can see in this controversy a great deal of confusion and doubt and frustration and discouragement for the lay person who's just getting conflicting messages about this very important sacrament from all of these various groups like the Catholic Church and the Lutherans and the Anabaptists. They're just trying to get it right, and they're wondering why all of this has to be so complicated, and they're looking for somebody who will finally come along and give them something that's clear and simple and easy to follow. And John Calvin and his book, Institutes of the Christian Religion, is going to fill that need, and that is why Calvinism, as harsh and oppressive and legalistic as it is going to spread like wildfire. And that brings us to our next question. What were the French Wars of Religion? How did they start? How did they end? And who were the combatants? So this happened in France between 1562 and 1598. It involved Catholics and Huguenots. It took place at all levels of French society, up to the very top ruling families, and it killed 3 million people. France was about 10% Huguenot by the 1560s, and remember that Huguenots are French Calvinists. Two noble families competed for the throne of France. The Bourbon family was Huguenot, the Guise family was Catholic, and fired up by the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. They wanted to rid France of Calvinism. The ruling family, the family that was actually on the throne, was the Valois family. They were Catholic, but not Catholic enough to suit the Guise family. And the Valois family and their top administrators and advisors, both Catholic and Huguenot, subscribed to a theory called politique, which advocated that the needs of the country, the needs of France, should come first before the needs of anyone's own religious agenda. Politique was seen by those who subscribed to it as the best way to prevent carnage and bloodshed. However, people like the Guise family, these ultra-Catholics, they saw it as weakness and wishy-washiness. And so the Guise family wanted to start a war which would pit French Catholics and French Huguenots against each other and hopefully conclude with their family at the throne of a religiously unified France. So that was their ambition. So they got the war they wanted when they orchestrated the massacre of a Huguenot congregation in a small town named Wassy in 1562. Meanwhile, the Politique Valois kings were having a lot of trouble riding out the storm and avoiding death by natural causes. 3 brothers ascended the throne and died in somewhat quick succession as their mother, Catherine de Medici, pulled the strings on their behalf. So the Politique Valois, they made an attempt to end the war in the year 1572 when the Valois sister, Margaret, was set to get married to one of the top Huguenot combatants, Henry Bourbon of Navarre. And this marriage was supposed to seal a peace between the Catholics, the Valois were the Catholics, but also Politiques, and the Huguenots. Henry of Navarre was a Huguenot, but also a Politique. They did get married, but the wedding was actually a disaster because the Guise family convinced the Valois king, Charles IX, that the Huguenots were going to use the wedding to overthrow him, and he was persuaded to massacre thousands upon thousands of Huguenots throughout Paris who had come to attend the wedding. Finally, the last Valois king, Henry III, made a deal with his brother-in-law, the Bourbon Huguenot, Henry of Navarre, that upon Henry III's death, the throne would pass to Henry of Navarre, and he would become Henry IV, the first Bourbon king of France. And that is exactly what happened in the year 1589. Henry III was assassinated, and Henry of Navarre, a Bourbon, a Huguenot, became King Henry IV of France. And he became king, technically, in 1589. This was not an easy transition. It took him 4 years to establish himself as king. The Catholics in Paris refused to accept him or any Protestant king, and you can't call yourself a French king by any stretch if you don't have Paris. And we talk about battles and sieges and stuff like that, but all of that would make this a much longer story. So Henry IV, to make this long story short, he had to convert from Calvinism to Catholicism in 1593 and convince the people of Paris that he was sincere about it before the city would capitulate and let him enter into it. And that's when Henry IV said those immortal words, "Paris is well worth a mass." He was thinking specifically of Paris's willingness to accept him as the legitimate French king. Paris was a tipping point for Henry's ascension to the throne of France. Once Paris found him agreeable, other towns did too, and Pope Clement VIII took away his previous excommunication of Henry IV, and Henry IV was officially coronated in 1594. And to finally bring this war to an end, he issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which officially ended the French Wars of Religion. So what was this Edict of Nantes? What did it say? The Edict of Nantes specified 150 French towns in which the Huguenots could practice their religion freely without persecution. Paris was explicitly excluded from being one of those towns. You know, those Parisians, got to keep them happy, so no Huguenots in Paris. The Huguenots could carry weapons, and they could even fortify those towns against attack. So going back to this Catholic Reformation, also called the Counter-Reformation, what was it? The Catholic Reformation, or Counter-Reformation, same thing, was the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation. After taking a massive blow to its confidence and its credibility at the hands of the Protestants, the Catholic Church rallied itself in a massive, decades-long effort to reassert its authority and, maybe more importantly, its relevance. The Protestant Reformation had caused the Catholic clergy from the very top to question itself, but the Catholic Church eventually found its footing again and came back swinging. Pope Paul III set the tone for this Counter-Reformation. His goals were to reconvert lost Catholics wherever they could and aggressively and authoritatively counter the intellectual and doctrinal arguments that were being made against them by the Protestants. And he identified three essential pathways to achieving these goals. Number one, we need to decide who we are and what we stand for so that we can draw clear lines between us and them that everyone can see. Number two, we need to tighten up church discipline with better training, better education, and more accountability. And number three, we need to be ready, willing, and able to go toe-to-toe with the Protestants in the arena of debate and show the world that we can effectively defend the doctrines that we believe. So the Council of Trent, what did the Council of Trent say? The Council of Trent was an 18 years long, on and off, council of church leaders who defined in very specific terms all the doctrines of the Catholic Church. And the amazing thing about the Council of Trent was that they did not compromise in the least with the Protestant Reformation. They reaffirmed, in other words, they held up all of the Catholic beliefs and practices that the Protestant Reformation had declared invalid, including the necessity of good works for salvation, all seven sacraments, transubstantiation, the authority of the priesthood, extra biblical sources of truth, elaborate ritual, ornate architectural structures, and they emphasize that you, the believer, you need to make your choice between Catholicism and Protestantism, and you better hope it's the right choice. And so that takes us to chapter 14, Exploration and Conquest. And the question is, what stimulated the Atlantic slave trade? That figures large in our course. The large-scale production of cash crops, especially sugar, really drove the Atlantic slave trade. Sugar is extremely labor-intensive. It has to be processed very quickly. It grows all year long. There's no particular sugar season. And this activity was going on even before America was discovered. And so what countries were involved in this exploration and conquest? At first, it was Spain and Portugal, but soon they had competitors in England, France, and the Netherlands. So how did the various countries that conducted exploration, conquest, and trade relate to each other? And the answer is that they were fierce competitors, even going to war with each other. So the Columbian Exchange, what was this Columbian Exchange and how did it affect people? The Columbian Exchange changed the trajectory of all life on this planet. It's the unintended exchange of plants, animals, people, ideas, and diseases. Examples were corn, tobacco, draft animals, slaves, immigrants, smallpox, Christianity, the English language, the Spanish language, French language. It completely transformed the Western Hemisphere. It caused a major die-off of literally thousands of different species of plants and animals over the last 500 years. New products from the New World caused an increase in slavery, caused the agricultural revolution, caused the population explosion, the enclosure movement, the industrial revolution, etc. So chapter 15, constitutionalism. What was the English Civil War all about, and what happened? So, the English Civil War, and we've talked about this extensively already, haven't we, with Oliver Cromwell, it was about two things. One of these was power. Should absolute power rest with the king, or should the king have to share power with others, most notably the nobility in Parliament? It was also about religion. You had a Protestant Anglican church, you had a Protestant Anglican Parliament with two powerful forces pulling on these institutions from either side. And it's hard to know with the English Civil War where to separate the religious controversy from the power controversy. Charles I went to war with Parliament really over both of these things. Charles I married a French princess, and she was the daughter of Henry IV, who we already talked about, and she was a Catholic. And he imposed the Anglican Common Book of Prayer on the Calvinist Scottish churches up in Scotland. And Charles I, Archbishop of Canterbury, whose name was William Laud, imposed bishoprics on the Calvinist Scotland. And all of this was highly antithetical to the most basic of Calvinist beliefs, as we've seen. You know how Calvinists are fundamentally against any kind of formal church structure or hierarchy. And this led to the Bishops' Wars of 1639 to 1640. Charles I attempted to impose his will on Scottish Calvinists, also known as Presbyterians, by force. He fought two small wars against the Scottish, which he lost. And to get peace, Charles I had to agree to give the Scots everything they wanted and pay for their war costs. And he signed off on this at the Treaty of Ripon in 1640. Well, this led to a war with Parliament, because in order to cover the cost of the bishops' wars, Charles I had to call Parliament for the first time in years and ask them for money. Charles I had been running the country without them for 11 years, but now he had to call Parliament, ask them for money. Well, first, Parliament was going to insist that Charles I not raise taxes or raise armies without their consent. And this dispute resulted in the English Civil Wars between the parliamentarians, also known as the Roundheads — Parliament had its own army — and the Royalists, also known as the Cavaliers — King had his own army. And that English Civil War lasted from 1642 to 1649. So let's talk about the parliamentary army. Their army was called the New Model Army. This was the name of the Parliament's army, and it was formed to fight Charles I in 1645 with Oliver Cromwell as second in command. This was a highly mobile, highly experienced, professional army. Cromwell recruited heavily from military veterans who had Puritan beliefs like his own and radical dissenting religious views. And in 1648, the New Model Army defeated Charles I's Royalist forces, and Charles I was captured. So, as we know, Charles I was eventually executed. The English killed their own king. And the way it went down was this: the radicals that Cromwell had recruited in the New Model Army, they wanted Charles I executed. But Parliament actually refused to execute him. They voted 125 to 58, clearly against his execution. So in order to overturn that refusal, the radicals in the army that Cromwell had recruited purged Parliament of any of the king's friends or supporters, leaving only what was called a rump parliament. And the word rump means remnant. And this rump parliament voted easily to execute Charles I with no problems, because he had no support left in this rump parliament. So Oliver Cromwell also reconquered Ireland between 1649 and 1653. He was still second in command at the beginning of the campaign. And he massacred a Catholic garrison. He banned Catholicism in Ireland. He executed priests. He confiscated Catholic-held lands and gave those lands to common Protestant settlers. And in 1650, Cromwell was made commander of the New Model Army, and continued to wage war in Ireland. And Oliver Cromwell eventually became Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. A couple of different attempts at a new parliament failed, and John Lambert wrote a new constitution. And he called his proposed constitution the Instrument of Government, and that was in 1653. And this document gave all Christians religious freedom, except, of course, Catholics. It named Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector for life. England was now called the Protectorate. And Charles II was finally brought in to be king soon after Cromwell died, and Cromwell's son made a failed attempt at effectively replacing Oliver Cromwell. So this Oliver Cromwell, what do we know about him? We know a lot of what he did, but who was he? What were his political beliefs? And I think we covered most of that just now. But also some things to keep in mind about him was he was a Puritan, he was a devout Christian, a staunch, violent anti-Catholic, a parliamentarian, a military leader, a military dictator with the title of Lord Protector, don't call him a king, and politically, he did not believe in divine right of kings. So, what is an absolute monarchy? What is a constitutional monarchy? So, an absolute monarchy is when the king has virtually no legal obstructions to his authority. He's basically an unopposed dictator. A constitutional monarchy is when the monarch's power is limited by a constitution, which gives substantial power to some kind of representative body, such as a parliament. So, chapter 16, towards a new world view, scientific revolution, enlightenment, enlightened absolutists. So, who was Copernicus? We'll start with him. And what did he do? He was a Polish astronomer, as we know, and a clergyman also. And he advanced the heliocentric theory on his deathbed in a book called The Starry Messenger. Galileo, who was he? What did he do? He was a scientist, an instrument maker, an astronomer, and an author. He wrote extensively about his observations of Jupiter and the moon. He advanced the heliocentric theory, and as we know, he came up with the law of inertia, and he was forced by the church to recant of his support for the Copernican theory, or as the church called it, the Copernican heresy. Who was Isaac Newton? What did he do? English scientist, mathematician. He synthesized the ideas of all those scientists that had come before him. Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, Galileo. And he explained all of them together mathematically in one unified book called Principia. That was its short name. He invented calculus, and he came up with the law of universal gravitation. So, chapter 17, the era of expansion. This agricultural revolution, what was it? And the agricultural revolution was an explosion in the efficiency of food production, beginning in England and the Netherlands and spreading throughout Europe. And what were two developments that drove it forward? You've got the scientific revolution, and you've got the Columbian Exchange. So, what was the enclosure system? And what were the results of it for rural workers? Keep in mind that this was an English process that took many decades to complete. It was conducted by both large landowners and the government. It was generally understood that if the agricultural revolution was to reach its full potential, then communal farming was going to have to be a thing of the past. Think of your field as your experimental agricultural laboratory. A laboratory can't have people and animals traipsing through it all the time, disrupting the experiment and contaminating the results. And so landowners stopped renting land to tenants and started fencing off or hedging off their fields. For labor, they hired only the amount of labor necessary to work these much more efficient fields. And the results for rural workers was that they had much less work to do and much less access to the land that they had been working for generations. So, what was this industrious revolution? It's really tied up with the agricultural revolution. The industrious revolution is the name that some historian gave to this rise in cottage industry in England and in other areas that were going through the agricultural revolution and its twin, the enclosure movement. And you had all these rural agricultural workers who were now underemployed, who needed to supplement their income. And you had these urban merchants of consumer goods who had an ever-growing market due to the growing population because there was more food to eat thanks to the agricultural revolution. All these things kind of build on each other in kind of a spiral almost. And so bring these two groups together, rural workers, urban merchants, and you had a marriage between them. And so by using rural workers working out of their homes, urban merchants could also get around the restrictions of these urban trade guilds who dominated and regulated the production of all kinds of goods in the cities. The key ingredient in this marriage of rural worker and urban merchant was the putting out system. So what was the putting out system? Putting out system referred to the arrangement that urban merchants had with these rural cottage industry workers. The biggest part of these consumer goods was textiles. So rural workers had the skills to make many kinds of consumer goods at home, but especially the spinning of thread and the weaving of textiles. The merchant would put out raw materials at the rural worker's house and then picked up those finished products later and pay the worker for their work. And that's basically how the putting out system worked, although depending on the industry, it had endless variations. So what did Adam Smith say about economics? And we've touched on him at numerous points. Adam Smith studied economics and wealth and production as if it was an organism under a microscope. And he came out against both mercantilism and trade guilds. He was an advocate of free trade, free markets, free enterprise. And he believed that healthy competition and letting people do what they did best out of economic self-interest was essential to creating a productive and efficient economy that could meet the different needs of people as much as possible. Smith was also an advocate of laissez-faire, which meant that the government should have a hands-off policy towards the economy and the market. If the government interfered with the economy and the market as little as possible, then the market would direct itself as if an invisible hand were guiding it. And that invisible hand would always make the right decisions. Smith was also an advocate of the specialization of labor as the most efficient means of industrial production, although he did acknowledge that doing the same exact thing over and over and over again all day long, day in and day out, could be spiritually demoralizing. He was also an advocate of paying workers higher wages so that these workers could then afford to be the customers of all of these products that this more efficient economy would produce in greater amounts. So, which European countries began to dominate economically in the 18th century and why? Well, the most dominant country in the 18th century Europe was undoubtedly Great Britain. They set out as a nation to be the kings of commerce in the Atlantic, and they systematically, through a system of all-out wars, knocked out their competitors one by one. Some wars that we mentioned were the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Jenkins' Ear, the War of Austrian Succession, and the 7 Years' War. Why did Great Britain pursue this path over the course of the 18th century? Controlling the extremely profitable Atlantic trade system would make that country rich beyond its wildest dreams. But these wars also pushed them to the brink of bankruptcy. Wars are expensive. And as a preview, and it's also a test question, Great Britain was going to raise taxes on their colonies in order to pay on all that war debt. And as you already know, the American colonies are going to rebel and start a revolution. And guess who is going to supply the Revolutionary Army with 90% of its gunpowder and a whole lot more just to get revenge on the British for the 7 Years' War? That's coming up. So, chapter 18, life in the era of expansion. Why was there an illegitimacy explosion in the 18th century? Remember that a pivotal year here is the year 1750. Historians like to point to that basic mid-century year as something of a fulcrum. Before 1750, illegitimate births were pretty low. Life was mostly rural village life. There was more community cohesion. Lots of people, for example, priests, ministers, parents, village elders, etc., were there to keep young people in line. If somebody got pregnant, two people were getting married for sure. And if somebody stepped out of line, the entire community took part in that person's public humiliation. The charivari was a perfect example of the kind of ritual punishment that you could expect to get. So social controls were strong in that kind of rural environment. But after 1750, things began to change thanks to the agricultural revolution, the enclosure movement, the growth of industry, not an industrial revolution quite yet, and the consumer revolution, which we've talked about. Illegitimate births rose dramatically for numerous reasons. People were migrating in large numbers to the cities where community ties were not nearly as strong. You did not have those same controls on behavior that you did back at the village. Young people had more anonymity and more autonomy, and increasing urban poverty meant that many people did not have the means to get married and start a family, even if somebody was pregnant. So how did the Enlightenment impact traditional religious beliefs? Enlightenment intellectual movements such as skepticism, deism, rationalism, they all chipped away at fundamental Christian beliefs. Central beliefs like, for example, the divinity of Jesus, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the centrality of Scripture, the sacraments, things like that, essential beliefs. The Enlightenment intellectuals criticized these beliefs as ignorant superstition. And as a rule, Enlightenment thinkers weren't atheists, but they weren't Christians either. That is one major difference between the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And these new Enlightenment ideas were even filtering their way into church leadership and into actual preaching that people were getting at church. And it produced a strong reaction from the more fundamental religious community, which was actually becoming stronger at this time rather than weaker. And this reaction was called pietism, and it occurred in both Protestant and Catholic circles. Pietism was an effort to get back to basics and take their religious life more seriously and make it more central to their daily lives, and to gain a measure of independence from the traditional church structure. And we've seen that effort before, haven't we, with Calvinism during the Protestant Reformation? And a good example of Protestant pietism was the Methodists under John Wesley. They developed during this time, and we learned about his story. And a good example of Catholic pietism was Jansenism. Not only were these movements a reaction to the Enlightenment and these Enlightenment thoughts like deism, etc., but they were also a reaction to the increasing dominance of the church by secular rulers who were trying to exert more control over their subjects through the church. Church leaders were often complicit in this secular power grab, And the pietists didn't like this meddling in their faith practices, and that's why both kings and popes didn't like the pietists either. So, what were the components of this consumer revolution? The consumer revolution is a big change in the Europeans' patterns of consumption that was closely tied with the agricultural revolution, with the Columbian Exchange, the Atlantic economy, and slavery. One of its main features was the sheer variety of foods and commodities and apparel and accessories that you could consume now. Before the Consumer Revolution, there wasn't much variety in, for example, what people ate. Two types of people that did enjoy more variety than the rest were wealthy people and urban people. So having variety in one's diet, it was a reflection of your wealth and your sophistication. New farming methods and new foods from America made variety more accessible and more affordable for people who were not aristocracy. Many of these raw materials, also known as commodities, raw materials, commodities, they were not staples, but instead they were used to make luxury items, mostly from America, and cultivated using slave labor. That's also important. And these were things like, for example, sugar, coffee, chocolate, rum, cotton, and of course, tobacco. People didn't consume these things because they needed them. You don't need these things. They consumed them because they enjoyed them. They made people feel a certain way. They maintained the kind of identity that people wanted to cultivate and project. And these products were also addictive. Rum, tobacco. And institutionalized slavery did two things for the consumer revolution. Number one, it increased the supply of these items and it made them more affordable for more people. And these commodities were increasingly popular among the non-aristocratic and the non-wealthy. And so 18th century people were not that different from 21st century people. They wanted to emulate the lifestyles of the elite and feel like they were also well-to-do themselves. They saw the advertisements for these products on signs and in newspapers, and they wanted to try these things out. And as a result, we see the lines between social classes starting to blur and become less distinct. Another aspect of the consumer revolution is the need for stimulants. Out on the farm, it wasn't uncommon to work the entire day slightly inebriated. But in the city, you couldn't do that, especially if you worked with machines. You needed a stimulant like tea and coffee to keep you awake and alert on the job. Another aspect of these commodities was they tended to be, like I said, mildly to severely addictive. So that's also driving the demand for these products. And finally, we see people deriving their sense of identity from these products. They're finding a sense of who they are in the things that they consume. Up to this point, your identity came most immediately from what you did for a living. But down there's this new source of identity. So I'll explain it like this. Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd? Cowboys or Patriots? Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings? Slytherin or Gryffindor? See how we do this? We identify ourselves by such things as the music we consume, the sports we consume, the shows we watch, the books we read, the cars we drive, the restaurants we visit, and countless other things that we consume. So why did the slave trade see a steep increase during this time? Because the slave trade really ramped up in the 18th century. And this is also an aspect of the consumer revolution. Europeans at this time were not fully aware of the signs of slavery all around them. They were not really thinking yet about the suffering and the cruelty that was behind the tobacco in their pipes, the coffee in their cups, the sugar in their spoons, the rum in their glasses, the cotton on their bodies. And eventually, stories about how horrible slavery was were going to start seeping into the European consciousness, and then you're going to see some big changes. Last question. What did Edward Jenner do? Jenner made the most significant medical breakthrough of the 18th century, and that was a century that didn't have many major medical breakthroughs. And he discovered that you could use cowpox, a relatively mild infection, to totally inoculate a person against smallpox, which was a horrific, deadly, devastating disease. You can still find photographs on the internet of people who suffered from smallpox before it completely disappeared from the face of the earth. And some of those photographs are just absolutely gruesome, very disfiguring disease. So that is our midterm review. I hope it helps you a lot. Hope you do really well on your midterm. Good luck, and we will see you then. Bye.